Welcome to Sumbits, where we decode the PowerSchool development experience. Sumbits is brought to you by MBA. Let's start the show.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Sumbits, joined always by Eric Scheitel and Ryan Cockrum. No guests today, just stuck with the three of us. Hope that's all right with everyone. As always, we're starting off the episode with a little drink. And it's been brought to my attention that we actually just released our 25th episode. I had no idea. So even though this is 26, we're going to celebrate a little bit. I'm bringing out a little bit of a fancier whiskey here. I don't know if you guys can see that, but this is Wild Turkey Master's Keep. This is their first rye Master's Keep. It's a yearly release. Very, 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 very good bottle. I don't have the box with me, but it's actually a pretty fancy box as well. As you can see, not a whole lot left in there. We did celebrate with this about a month ago with a couple friends of mine. But anyway, I still have some left to enjoy with you guys. Again, Master's Keep Cornerstone. It's a Wild Turkey product. Delicious stuff. What are you guys drinking today?
I'm sticking with the brews for the time being. I mean, for today. I'm not switching. I've got a Cobra Clutch from Parallel 49. It's a double IPA. It's a stronger, beautiful can. They have a lot of fancy looking cans, and depending on how quickly this one goes down, I've got a Wavelength. It's a West Coast IPA. This is another one out of Winnipeg by Sucrose Brewing. Yep. They have a bunch of kind of all their cans are very psychedelic looking. Not that this one isn't, but
A little bit different.
Yeah.
What about you, Eric?
Well, so I'm going to start out with an apology to our listeners because Sean and I were at a conference. You were wondering if I was going to go here. Uh-huh. I told Sean after we had this experience that I owe our listeners an apology. We met a lovely gentleman in Indiana just last week who mentioned to us that he enjoyed the podcast and he was really happy that he was learning about some cool new bourbons and whiskeys from Sean. And it occurred to me
he was
that
interested in beers as well.
He was, and I realized that I'm really letting our listeners down. So I'm going to make a real concerted effort from this point forward to be a little more, bring something other than the Miller Lights to the game with me. So I got a couple of them here right now. And my local grocery store carries a lot of local brews, so I might stick, close to home. But the good news is, friends, I live in Wisconsin, so there's a plethora of options from close to home. And actually, this one is just down the street. I could walk there in about 10 minutes. This is the Capitol Brewery right here in Middleton, Wisconsin. So I always say Madison because that's the home of NBA, but I'm just a stone's throw away from Madison here in a little suburb called Middleton. And this is the Capitol Brewery. They've got a wonderful beer garden. Please come look us up and hang out at the beer garden with me if you're ever in the area. And this is their Maibach. And much like Ryan, in case I go through this too quickly, I've got me a backup right here. This is from the Hinterland Brewery, and it is a Luna Coffee Stout. Hinterland is in Green Bay. Go Backers.
A nice hot summer day brew right there.
Oh my gosh, yes. And we actually have a heat advisory today, and I'm drinking stout. I don't know what's wrong with me.
I was looking at the porters and the stouts when I was picking for today's episode. I was like, you know what? It's just too hot. I can't do those ones right now.
It's when you reach for the wheats.
When we were in South Carolina, we met a few fans of the podcast as well. And I'm not going to mention names because I don't know. I didn't get permission to mention any names, but thank you guys for watching too. I know a couple of those were definitely getting into the bourbon game and the whiskey game a little bit because of the podcast as well. So hopefully you guys are getting some PowerSchool stuff out of it too and not just drinking. But either way, glad you're watching and listening.
No, sorry. I do. Before I finish, I have a throwback to our last episode that I want to bring back up, but you.
No, I was just going to say, it just so happens, gentlemen, that near where I grew up, which is near La Crosse, Wisconsin, I come from a family of, we're Wisconsinites, so we're drinkers. I've got a cousin who opened a brewery near where I grew up, and I've got another cousin who opened a distillery where I grew up. So I really think that maybe one of these days there ought to be a road trip and an on-site
Right.
episode in store.
Sounds
Just
like
saying.
sponsorship opportunities.
Right.
Sounds like something around Halloween.
Ooh.
No, we on our last episode when we were talking about the acronyms and the abbreviations, none of us had a clue what DCID was.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and one of our very own, I don't know if we're saying names here too.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, Lynn Corthell, is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lynn Corthell. She watched the episode, and basically because she likes to dig up info, which I think many of us who work in PowerSchool with PowerSchool like to do. We sent her down a rabbit hole, and she found the following. The correlation IDs are described as follows: Diagnostic Context ID, or DCID, and Execution Context ID, or ECID. This is the unique identifier which identifies the request flowing through the system. There's more to it. I'm not going to just go off, but basically this is an Oracle, a property of Oracle records, and that's where DCID came from and what it stands for. So we have our answer finally after, I know, for me, a decade.
So DCID is specific to Oracle. Did other databases adopt it? Or I guess I just haven't worked much with other databases to know if they use DCID or not.
That I don't know. I'm just reading what.
There you go, Lynn.
This is from the Oracle blogs. Yeah, this is from the Oracle website. That's where she posted the link.
Right on.
Yeah. But yeah.
Well, hey guys. So got me thinking about 25 episodes. Let's kind of, we were thinking about going back in time, and as we typically do on this, we talk a lot about how PowerSchool's changed over the years, and we tend to kind of dive in on some certain topics, and that's what we want to do again today. We all kind of started with PowerSchool at a different point, but there's still been a lot of major changes that have happened in, say, the last 5 years or so. That we kind of wanted to discuss today, since it's just the three of us. And we do have a little short list of things to talk about today, but I figured we'd just jump right in, since we do have the fancy developers with us today. API was relatively new. Do you guys remember when PowerSchool introduced the API?
I don't actually, because I did not interact with it for a long time after it was introduced. I just kind of started kind of peppering its way into the PSU classes and topics on the forums and stuff like that. But I definitely cannot tell you when that started happening.
Well, let me ask this: when did you guys start using it, and how long after you first hearing about it did it actually excite you enough to dive in?
I'll jump in on this one. So I want to say, I don't remember the year. I want to say it was probably about halfway through my career, which has now been, let's say, a 12, 13-ish year career with MBA and customizing PowerSchool, is when the API first came out. So 2009, so 2015. Let me just say 2015. Somebody will leave a comment and correct me, but we're going to say 2015 is when the API came about. And after that, PowerSchool hosted something called DevCon, which I had the privilege of being allowed to attend. And I got to say, my first experience, that was kind of my first exposure to the API, and I did not realize at that point the value that it offered. I feel like most of the folks that were at that conference were third party ISP, the vendors, the third party that were hoping to integrate with PowerSchool in a more seamless way from outside of PowerSchool with their own server-side code on their own systems. So honestly, part of me was writing it off at that point. We were talking a lot about authorization from an outside server. And there were some terms and concepts that were brand new to me in terms of OAuth, and we're talking about client IDs and secrets and the handshake and exchanging a client ID and a secret for an authorization token. My head was spinning, and I'm like, I don't know if I should. I'm not quite following this, but I don't know if it matters that I'm not following it. As time went on, I realized that it was something that I did need to follow. But again, I'd kind of written it off initially. Like, I don't know if this is really relevant in that I'm developing customizations for PowerSchool and I'm retrieving the data from within PowerSchool. So what's the point? But really, at the end of the day, I'm so glad that PowerSchool introduced the API, because it does, especially when we're talking about interacting and what we call CRUD operations, CRUD, create, read, update, delete, for a large set of records. If we have to mass insert records or mass update records, that can really be done from within PowerSchool and the plugins that we create with HTML form submissions, but it's really a lot slower than using the API.
Can I interrupt just for 1 second? I'm really
I'll hold it
glad,
against you, but you can interrupt.
That's fine. I'm really glad you said that, because I think for me that I was in a very, very similar boat where, when I first started hearing about API, it was always about getting information into another system. Well, I worked for the district. I never cared about getting it into another system unless whatever vendor I was working with, that was going to make things easier. But still, I didn't have to deal with it. So it's even, it's been within probably the last year or so where I really start thinking about the API as something that you can use within PowerSchool instead of just third parties. So I just wanted to reiterate that, because I would like to think that I was in that boat. A lot of people that are listening are also thinking like, yeah, API, like I see that there's classes on this all the time, but I work for a district. What do I need to know the API for? And I'm glad you're kind of going down this rabbit hole, if you will. But like some examples of what API can do within PowerSchool, I think would be really useful to hear.
Right. So if I can kind of expand on that and talk to the point, like why should someone who's listening to us that's just working within a district care? Well, again, if you're getting heavy into customizations, I'd say for me, my primary concern is that as I'm writing my plugins, I want the best user experience that we can get. And if I go to a page and let's just say the MBA fees plugin, I want to mass assess fees, and I've got 2,000 fees to create. I can do that 10 times faster, and I'm not exaggerating. In fact, I'm probably underselling it when I say 10 times faster for a user experience with the API as opposed to using form submissions. Another thing about the API is for folks to understand that when we're working with Power Queries, those Power Queries actually become an API endpoint. So if anybody's generated a Power Query, little did they know they were actually working with the API. They're generating what's called an endpoint for the PowerSchool API. Those can then be consumed by our third parties or scheduled in Data Export Manager to export data to a third-party SFTP server. So I think that can be really useful. And I know that there are folks out there that are just begging for me to mention that one thing, that really great example that they've used the API for that maybe hasn't fallen into my experience. So I hope we'll get some great comments and feedback on this episode that we can share next time we come around. But
yeah, for sure.
Sean, Ryan, maybe you have other thoughts as well.
Well, I wanted to go back to when you were saying the first time they were talking about the API and everything was like coming at you and you didn't know what the heck you're experiencing with all the promises and the tokens and everything like that. That's exactly how I remember my first experience with it too. And getting RESTful plugins to install in Firefox or Chrome, and get half the session would be spent on how to generate that, and then we'd get into the API, and I'd be like, "But what was I just doing right now?" I was just learning how to access the API. But my first real use of the API, I would say, in a bigger spectrum, was with PowerTeacher Pro. Which heavily uses it. I mean, a lot of places in PowerSchool use it, but in figuring out how to make customizations for PowerTeacher Pro and write to a lot of the existing tables, but also to custom tables, you leverage the API. because it's already there and it's already happening, and you're almost modifying what's in there. Yeah.
One other thing I'd like to note about the API is, I think for a lot of our listeners, if you're working within a district, you're working with these clients who are providing for you plugins so that they can get access to your data. So understanding the API, even if you're not writing code to interact with the API, is beneficial in terms of if you click on the name of a plugin in the plugin management console, it will list out what's contained within that plugin. In fact, many of you have probably had a third-party vendor provide a plugin and say, we need you to click on the plugin and provide for us the client ID and secret. Basically, what you're providing for them are the credentials to be able to access the API, the username and password, to oversimplify it there. But that's what you're providing. And when they provide that plugin, when you provide a client ID and secret, you're not providing unfettered access to your data. The access or access requests are what they're called within the API, explicitly define which fields that third party is asking for access to, as well as whether they're asking for view only or read write access to those fields. Now, sorry, I feel like I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here, but I have to bear with me.
No, I think this is great.
There are, and I might fumble through this a little bit, but I'll express my understanding of this, as I haven't worked with what we call the version 1 endpoints very significantly myself, but this was something that really took me by surprise. The earlier version of the initial version of the API included what we call version 1 endpoints. And that includes things like student information are included as a version 1 endpoint. And what I discovered is that any user with any access token, any client ID and secret, will have access to those version 1 endpoints. Unlike the later iterations of the API where they secured things a little bit better, and you need to explicitly say if the client provides me the client ID and secret, I get access to A, B, C, and D, and is it read or is it write? Some of these version 1 endpoints, which do include student data, included in any client ID and secret, is read access to all the student data within the database. So that's an important thing to be aware of.
So are you saying that like those fields didn't have to be explicitly defined?
That is exactly what I'm saying.
And what is that? Because there's I think a name of a framework you're describing here without calling it. What is that? What are you talking about here?
I think what you're referring to is the data restriction framework, or the DRF as we call it. So the DRF, or data restriction framework, was built by PowerSchool to restrict access to specific fields. So for example, when you write a Power Query, you could write a Power Query to request sensitive data, such as students' lunch status, etc. And with the data restriction framework, basically, this is one of the reasons that PowerSchool has really been pushing developers to move away from using T-list SQL in their development and move toward using Power Queries. It's because when a Power Query runs, if it's run, sometimes you may hear a reference to the external API versus the internal API. But the fact of the matter is there's only one PowerSchool API. There are two ways to authenticate to be able to use said API. One is via external, or this OAuth authentication with the client ID and secret. And the other is internally, which is based on browser cookies. Is the user logged into PowerSchool? And basically those permissions, then the data restriction framework basically rewrites your Power Query so that it restricts access to the fields that any query might request based on what field level security is set up, etc., and what the current users, user groups and roles are.
So is that the framework that's being leveraged when you're in Data Export Manager?
I do believe it's being applied in Data Export Manager, particularly because Data Export Manager allows users to execute Power Queries. There's a number of subsets of data that you can access in Data Export Manager. There are core tables, there are extended tables, additional data sets, and I know I'm forgetting one.
There's
But I believe in the additional data sets, you can find any Power Queries that are installed into the system. And yes,
or show all.
execution of those Power Queries, they get wrapped in basically an alternate query, which is great in a way, and why PowerSchool wants us to be using those, because the data restriction framework is then responsible for ensuring, especially from an internal perspective, that if Sean Cobby's executing his Power Query, we're not providing fields to him that field level security or other security settings don't provide for
does
him.
go down to field level security?
Yes, it does. The problem with this is, and don't get me wrong, it's been a real thorn in my side and a frustration for me as a developer. So hear me whine for a moment and then listen to me try to back off of that. Power Queries drive me absolutely crazy, especially from a performance perspective, because as they get rewritten by the data restriction framework, the performance of those queries can take a huge hit.
Mm.
And I find that extremely unfortunate. Another thing that I find unfortunate is, personally, I feel that it's overly restrictive at some points. For example, I'd written a Power Query where I wanted to expose for students or guardians what classes were being taught that were scheduled in Power Scheduler for the upcoming year, because some of our districts want the students and guardians to be able to see what's the schedule for next year, and maybe even to be able to choose what sections am I interested in attending next year. The problem is the query that retrieves that data joins to the school staff or teachers table, so that we know so that they can potentially see what teachers are teaching those classes. Now, we've given them the flexibility to hide or show that teacher name depending upon the district's preferences. But it turns out that the data restriction framework, as you join that teachers table or school staff table, I should say, will restrict access based on only teachers. They're basically saying a student has no right to look at a teacher unless that student has at some point in history been taught by that teacher. So in trying
to looking at next year, that's very possible that teacher never had that kid.
Absolutely.
You can argue that does make logical sense. However, yes.
Absolutely.
Right. So that's where I've found the Power Queries in particular to be particularly frustrating. But to back up from that and not just go off on a tirade about these things are terrible, I wouldn't want to be the poor SOB that had to figure out the logic behind the data restriction framework to make sure that we're not violating any FERPA laws or anything crazy like that. So, I mean, it's frustrating. There are drawbacks, but there's so much potential in what they've done with the API as well. And wow, I've been rambling for a long time now. So
no, that's really. I mean, you did a really good job of explaining it, because I've never heard it explained quite like that, and it actually leads me, because I'm kind of stuck on that field level security thing. So if me, Sean Cobby, as a user in a PowerSchool instance, have field level security that does not give me access to date of birth, when I go to Data Export Manager and I'm in the students table, do I still have access to everything else? Is DOB still listed, or does it just remove it from that list, or is it listed and I can check on it, it's just not going to export it? I don't know if you know the answer or not. I'm just kind of curious at this point.
I feel like my answer is the same as Ryan's answer based on looking at his facial expression right now.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never tried that. So
I feel like it'd be a giant hole if it.
Yeah. So I mean, because I know working with, people with one-on-ones and help desk and all that fun stuff, and we go try to look at something in Data Export Manager, and because of the role security, they don't have access to it. I get that, but when we're talking about those roles, and whether it's, I guess page permissions wouldn't really take into account, but field level security absolutely would. And I'm just curious what effect that actually has in Data Export Manager. I feel like that's something that I should know, and I don't.
Well, I'm going to say I would guess with 95% certainty that field would simply be hidden from the students table in Data Export Manager.
Again,
Now, in
I'm
a
sure
different
the whole
context, it's a really different context if we're talking about a field in a table versus a column that's the result of a Power Query. And this is where I don't remember specifically either. Let's just say you tried to run a Power Query and one of the fields returned by the Power Query is the student's date of birth. I want to say, I feel like you just couldn't execute that Power Query. I don't feel like they've implemented field level security to the level that says, we'll give you the results minus that column. They're just going to say that query requests a column you don't have access to, therefore you can't run it. Now, it could be wrong.
But so, I mean, I agree with that assessment. However, now I'm not going to say it, just in case. Just in case. Yeah.
You don't want to be wrong. I don't care.
Well, no, it's more like I don't want to say anything that people might take advantage of, and maybe it's a bad thing. So Ryan didn't think of anything right there. But I do want to actually take this now as, because as we've been talking about this, and we were talking about how, the security that these tokens give and how they don't give unfettered access. It's something I just kind of reflected on now as we're talking. I remember, frequently enough, not frequently, but it would come up enough on some of the forums, people going, we're trying to sign up with this vendor and they're asking for an account to our system in order for their plugin to work in our system. And inevitably someone would always throw in like, that shouldn't be required. It should, they shouldn't just have whatever. They should be able to figure out something else. This is, of course, before API. Now, after API, then when these plugins that were, pulling out data and everything like that, I don't see that topic come up anymore. I don't, because now the API has the right access to the right things that these people need. Right. So whenever you're dealing with these plugins, it's basically because these plugins would essentially pull out all this data to a third party, and any data, as you're saying, and you would have to consider it, but your options were either do it or don't have this service,
right?
Because that was what the options were. And then the API was introduced, and now you have the option to do it without just giving all your students' health information, just so that you can send a notification when there's a weather warning.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to think that PowerSchool administrators have a little bigger seat at the table in decision making now than they did 10, 15, 20 years ago, because I know when I was a PowerSchool administrator, in my earlier days of being a PowerSchool administrator, a lot of times those decisions were made, hey, we bought this, now make it work. So like, yeah, you didn't really have an option. It was like,
the grumbles I've heard from the administrators I've talked to. I've never been in that boat, but I've heard stories.
It is a nice comforting feeling knowing that the API exists now to where, they're only gaining access to the data that they need in order to make that service work. And it's not, hey, go create me an account.
Okay, so can I devil's advocate you on that?
Sure.
I mean, big deal. Just create them an account, put them in a security group. Don't give them access to everything. Just page level permissions. I mean, or am I oversimplifying that, Sean?
No, you're not.
No, that's absolutely what we did.
Okay,
but you're also forgetting that like the page permissions and the access, like the field level security, didn't exist either at that point either. So before it really
was level did. Pretty early.
Page level, but in reality, you can still have someone write a T-list and get all the data out.
So you bring up a really interesting point, because what you just said, Sean, like pre-API, I'm a third-party vendor. I need to get data out of PowerSchool. And I feel like this is a really fun topic because MBA was contacted by a third party that wasn't as familiar with PowerSchool, but wanted to integrate with a messaging service for PowerSchool. And I'm not dropping any company names here. Let's just suffice it to say it was a messaging company. They needed to get data out of PowerSchool. This was pre-API. You know how a lot of companies got data out of PowerSchool pre-API? It was called screen scraping. And basically what you do...
This is where we did, for the topic of this episode, we wanted to know what happened before the new option was. And this is now, what did we do before the API? So yeah, sorry to interrupt there, but please go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, bear with me for one moment, because that Maibach that I just introduced you to is gone. So we're going to bust out the stout, even though it's a hot day here in Wisconsin.
Hopefully your air conditioner's moving.
Oh, the air conditioner is running well. Okay,
Speaking of little tangent, my wife just waved at me and said that our air conditioner tech is going to be here in about 10 minutes because our air conditioner went out last night. Anyway, please continue.
What's worse, when you live in the Midwest, or probably even in Canada, I mean, what's worse, when your air conditioner goes out in the middle of the hot, humid summer, or I also had my furnace go out in the middle of January once. Yeah, I don't know.
I'd rather have my heat go out.
I've had both.
You can always get a blanket, right?
That's right. You can only take off so many clothes. Nobody wants to see that.
I've had both. Luckily, it was when the furnace went out twice. I had the furnace go out. Luckily, it was early enough in the season the one time that it didn't matter, and the second time it was just the igniter, so I could do it with a barbecue lighter until the technician came and actually got the piece replaced.
Perfect.
And at this point, we're just going to forget about talking about screen scraping or any of that, and let's talk more about the climate here in the Midwest. In Canada.
Yeah.
No, but so prior to the API, I can speak from experience with a few different companies that I've interacted with. I don't know what the third-party vendors at large were doing, but I'd seen at least a couple examples of you can actually create a program that will imitate a user navigating the web. So really what you do, and what I actually helped a company do back in the day, this is almost embarrassing to admit, but I didn't know of a better solution, and I don't know at the time that there was a better solution.
I mean, the fact that there's a term for it tells me that you weren't the only one doing it.
Well, also, I'm aware of the principle because it was in textbooks that I was learning how to web develop from. Like, there was whole chapters dedicated to it, so it is a legitimate option. It's
fair enough.
So,
So step one, create a PowerSchool plugin with some custom screens. Into those custom screens, you embed TList SQL. And via that TList SQL, you generate a web page. It might be an HTML page with a table on it and rows and columns of data. Or you might even use TList SQL to generate XML. Install that. Step two, you create a server-side application. In my case, it was created in Java because when I was in school, that's what I learned. So I created a Java program, installed a Java library that did gosh, I can't remember the name of the library now, but imitates a user logging into the web, navigating to a web page. You can imitate that user entering text into a text box, clicking on a button, etc. So I imitated that user. Bear with me now. Going to the client server, typing in username, semicolon, password. Some of you know what I'm talking about, right?
Uh-huh.
And then I knew that would take you to the home page, and you're now logged in, and now I could navigate to the page that was installed via the plugin that spit out all the data. And screen scraping, which is funny, it's a funny term when you think about it, because at this point, it's just a program. There's actually no screen there. but it's going to return that information that's intended to be displayed on the screen. Instead, that program would just scrape that data that was intended to be displayed and store it in its own database for use for its third-party intention. So I brought up the fact that at the time that I built that, if anybody's been around long enough and remembers, back in the day, to log into the admin portal in PowerSchool, you would actually, there was one text box when you logged in. You would type in your username followed by a semicolon followed by your password.
Yeah, that was always a fun training thing.
Right.
Like, do what?
And
No
herein lies
spaces.
part of the problem with screen scraping is that program needs to be programmed to assume certain things about the pages, the websites that it's interacting with. So all of a sudden PowerSchool upgrades and they introduce a username and password input box, and the screen scraping program can successfully log in if the user hasn't updated. But if they have updated, they need an alternate version. And oh man, it was a necessary evil back in the day, but it was messy. And that solution's no longer in place. That solution's now been replaced by Power Queries and exporting that data via scheduled exports from Data Export Manager to an SFTP server. Much cleaner solution.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. That's interesting you bring up logging in, because one thing that Ryan had mentioned when we were talking about this episode was how different staff logins has changed over the years. I think a lot of people that have been on PowerSchool for a number of years remember the days of having your music teachers or your band teachers or your art teachers that would change between schools. You had to have a completely separate login for them to log into the different schools. It was your idea, Ryan, so I'll let you kind of.
Well, I remember, at first trying to figure out the best way to differentiate their logins. So, I mean, it would be school initials. So these, and I felt for them, really, because I mean, this one user would have to have 6 logins for 6 buildings that they would be doing all on their own laptop, all on the same laptop that they carry from site to site to site, because it's not a domain issue at all. Right. And then they'd have to log out and go, R Cockrum SES and R Cockrum RWBB, and I mean, what a monumental pain to actually have to do that. And then on top of that, the training issues from that would be like getting phone calls going, I'm in here and I'm not seeing my students. I logged out and I logged back in. Did you actually?
Yeah, right.
Or did you log right into the back one? Or I entered all my grades and then they didn't save. And correct me if I'm wrong, and I remember how the logins worked with the old Power Teacher gradebook. But I mean, if you logged out, you could get logged out of Power Teacher, but it wouldn't appear that you're logged out of Power Teacher gradebook.
Right.
But sometimes, you'd log out of Power Teacher, log into the new one, not switch over your gradebook, and then continue working at it. And then, think you're in one school entering it, and then you get an error. And I mean, I think there was I don't remember if there was an easy solution around that. But the point is that, you're entering data that you're losing, or you think you've entered it and you don't see the error pop up when you try to submit it.
Yeah.
And then you go,
and you just spent 25 minutes putting in grades that went nowhere.
Yeah. But then unfortunately the perception of the user is I entered it. And then I came back the next day, and it was all removed. Someone logged in and deleted it on me.
Right.
Which did not happen. Right. But it's easy to understand why they thought that happened. So, I mean, in the end, PowerSchool did introduce the option now to, have one login for teachers that could switch sites. I remember, I think there was a functionality that merged them. See, I can't remember now because it was a while, or you just had to go and like pick one and make it that theirs and add the different ones. I want to say I remember there was like some kind of migration option, but and it's been 10 years, so I can't remember. It was introduced relatively soon after I started using PowerSchool. That much I remember. What do you
I think
guys?
it's the thing that some of that is still hanging on when you like search for staff or students from the start page. It'll have individual different, which looks like separate accounts, even though they are the same
Yep.
account.
I get once or twice a year, someone I'm supporting will point that out and it's ultimately a misunderstanding on their part, which is understandable. But they'll say, I'm looking for my user, but it says I have 5. For some reason, I don't understand why I have 5. Whenever I click on them, it all goes to the same one.
Or I don't know which one to click on, so I haven't done anything. Yeah,
that one too. Yep. And the answer is they're all the same user. If you click on anyone, they will go to the same user. By record in the school staff table, they are all distinct. However, they all do relate to the same user record in the users table, which is really the one that matters in this case.
So I know this wasn't necessarily part of the plan, but I would love to dive down that rabbit hole a little bit, because it's been mentioned a few times, and we've talked about the teachers table, and we talk about the teachers table. Usually there's a couple grins, either on screen or people that are listening, because the people that know that the teachers table isn't really a table. So anymore, right? Exactly. So again, talking about things that have changed over the years, like if you guys want to dive down,
Sure.
Teachers table, users table, school staff table, like.
And I want to talk about that and pose a question at the same time, because I'm not really sure about this, and maybe one of you guys knows more. I want to dive into what Ryan said about when I search for myself, I see 5 records, but they all take me to the same record. So what used to be the teachers table represented one user at one school, right? That could divide it into a users table and a school staff table. Okay. So each physical person represented in the database, if I'm talking Ryan Cockrum, there's one record in the users table now for Ryan Cockrum. It's got his demographic information, the stuff that is identical from school to school to school to school to school. Now, so his last name, his first name, and this is wonderful, right? Because Ryan gets married and changes his last name, right? And now I changed that user's record, and it's changed.
That's what they do in Canada, right?
I think that's how it works in Canada. Yeah.
No, it's actually changed your middle name.
Oh. But so in the past, right, there was a separate record. There were 5 records for Ryan. All of them had his demographic information, and I had to update it in all 5 places. But of course, it's going to get missed, right?
Right.
So hence the whole point of consolidating that into one user. But then the thing is, his role at school A, B, C, and D might differ from one school to the next, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I don't know the answer to this question, but okay, so I search for Ryan Cockrum. I find 5 records. I find a district office record, a high school record, a middle school record, an elementary school record. No matter which one I select, if I go to the information and change Ryan's first name to Eric, because that's what all the cool kids call themselves, then that's going to change Ryan's first name across the board, no matter at all schools. But if I go to his security settings and change something there, right? Because I think part of the whole point also of having the school staff is to allow Ryan a certain maybe administrator level access at the high school, but just a counselor type access, or
right.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you can set the security per school with the new implementation. And Ryan's squinting and shaking his head, so I could be wrong.
I'm not aware of, and maybe it's wrong. I will say my understanding of the school staff table would be more like this. So the user, it's almost like this. It's like, and I'm just coming up with this now, so I could be completely off base here. But the users table represents your access to the admin portal. The school staff table represents your access to Power Teacher. And that might be the wrong way to put it, but really when I think about it, like there isn't.
So what you're talking about when you go to a staff in the admin portal and then you click on security settings, it takes you to, and you have the two tabs, right? You have the teacher tab and then the admin tab. You're saying that the school staff info, the school staff records is what's shown on the teachers tab, not the admin tab.
I don't think that might be, like, it might show it on both, but I feel like really though the access, like, because when you log in to, like, you set the permissions for each of those tabs separately, right?
So on the teachers tab, it's where you can add the different schools where they have access to and select a home school.
And you just log in and out of the Power Teacher portal.
Correct.
Yeah. And then on the other one is where you set which schools you can switch to between when you're logged in as an admin user.
Correct. And
So
then there you can set a security group, but then set different roles by school.
And there's a record on the users table that can switch to, and usually it's kind of like a club. It's like an array, but it's like, 0, then 100, 200, 300, all comma separated, because those are the ones you can switch to. But then when you're in Power Teacher, the ones you can log into and switch to in there are based off of the records on that teacher tab.
Now that I'm processing what you've said, I'm starting to feel like I should be embarrassed about my earlier comments. That's okay. I don't mind making a fool of myself.
It's all learning, right?
I'll I mean, if it's still on the same topic, the one thing I always, when people talk about the teachers, view, and then of course school staff and user staff, I am very adamant about just using users and the school staff when I'm writing queries and things like that. I like to just stick with the tables. I understand what the view is. I understand that it's derived from those tables. I just want to use the table. That's how I am. And
it feels more pure.
I wasn't going to say it, but there, now you said it, sure, I'll go with that. It feels more pure to me. Some people like to go ahead and use the teachers, and I can't help but cringe every time I see someone writing a query and they're referencing the teachers table. And I'm like, it's not the table, just let's, and I get it in this case, because I mean, there are other views, and I cannot think of one right now, but there are other views in PowerSchool that there are tables that replaced other tables, so the old table became a view. And in those instances, it was a one-to-one replacement, let's say, and I don't mean one-to-one relationship as in a database, but like this table replaced that view. In this case, it's two tables replaced one view. And so technically now you have more to write in your query and more things to consider when you're crafting it. However, it's still more pure to me.
Okay. And here, in defense of the people that still use teachers, and I may or may not be one of those people. And honestly, in my spirit, Ryan, I agree with you. I do. But one thing that drives me nuts is you still look at other tables that relate to our teachers, like the sections table.
Teacher ID.
And there's a field in there called, I think it's only called teacher.
Oh, you're right. On the CC table, it's teacher ID. On the sections table, it's teacher, which is, yeah.
Yeah. And can I tell you, I spent the last couple of months training in 4 new developers and trying to get these poor people familiar with the PowerSchool schema and foreign keys and primary keys, and school ID actually means school number and term IDs aren't unique, and all of the other craziness that is PowerSchool. Like, there's a field in the sections table called teacher, and you just look at it and you're like, I really just want to read a column name and know instinctively
what it is.
what it means. I mean, it is. It's easier to use the teacher's table. It's like, oh, that must be the teacher's table's ID. And then I don't even remember off the top of my head. I think it's actually maps to the ID column in the school staff table now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. It's not intuitive. You're right. And then the fact of that too is, and if you're writing any queries that work on the staff pages and you're using the FRN, the record number is going to reference the DCID on the users table. So your query is now going to, and I mean, you can use current teacher ID or whatever the other one is, and but if you're going to use the RN, again being more the pure method, now you have to join your users to the school staff on users underscore DCID to school staff users underscore DCID, and then join your sections to school staff ID to sections.teacher.
Makes total sense.
It is a bit of a ladder to climb, let's say.
Called a learning curve, right?
Yeah.
But I feel like
the
the last
in
few...
my case, I was in my case, there's a bias in that I've done it so long that I know it and I remember it.
Yeah.
I can put myself in the shoes of somebody who is looking for something more intuitive, like you're saying, and go like, yeah, that makes not much sense for somebody who's just approaching it for the first time. Why would you think that the teacher column on the sections table references an ID? First of all, you would think it would be a name maybe, and then references the ID on the school staff table. Yeah. So I mean, I feel for that.
Yes, there are, and even amongst this conversation, there was a little stuttering that went on earlier by you, Ryan, and I feel like you were trying to find the alternative for the expletive you wanted to use.
Possible.
I've been there, and I know in talking to some of our new developers and getting them comfortable with, or trying to get them comfortable with PowerSchool, there have been a few expletives. Just try to keep reassuring them that one day school ID means school number will not even be a second thought,
Yeah.
I feel like most people that have ever done any of this work has used an expletive or two, so you're all in good company. Well, hey guys, time flies by when you're having fun. Unless there's something that you really wanted to get out, I think we're at a good stopping point.
Sure.
You guys good? All right. I do think we got plenty more to talk about, so probably foresee another episode coming out with kind of similar topics. So everybody, thanks for watching. Always good to have you with us. Again, reach out to us, sumbits@mba-link.com. Leave us a comment below. Let us know.
And if you're just listening and not watching, be aware that our friend Ryan Cochran looks more and more like Jason Momoa every day.
Jason Momoa without a sit-up.
Without a sit-up. Check out the YouTube version, friends.
The wish.com version of Jason Momoa. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Enjoy more episodes and learn more at mba-link.com.